Shackled to the dungeon wall, Jax had never for a second lost focus. Seized, tortured, the Alpha would have his revenge. The beast stirred, calculating its escape. Its blood boiled, raging at the monster that had captured him. Thoughts of the night he'd been kidnapped flashed through his mind. He'd been sitting in his friend Finn's nightclub, drowning his troubles in a bottle of scotch, mourning the death of his beta, Nick. Getting drunk hadn't dulled his senses enough to curtail his heroic tendencies. When he'd spied a woman falling unconscious on the dance floor, he'd rushed to her side. Stunned, he'd thought he recognized the injured beauty. Katrina Livingstons. At one time, the Alpha had suspected she could have been his mate. They'd met at a holiday party. A simple handshake had pricked a sexual awareness that he'd never experienced with another female. The strange sensation had temporarily abated after he'd thought she'd left, and he'd reasoned it had been a fluke. But later in the evening, he'd found her on the balcony, taking in the sight of winter's first snowflakes, and they'd connected. Sitting next to the outdoor fireplace, she'd accepted his jacket. Discussing everything from publishing to ice skating, their conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours. They'd laughed and discovered they both loved visiting New Orleans. An artist, she'd been born and raised in Louisiana, but had moved to Philadelphia with her brother. He'd asked her on a date, wishing to take her on a tour of his city, but she simply smiled, a sad expression washing over her face. When Jax had gone to the bar to get drinks, he'd returned to find that she'd disappeared. It wasn't as if he'd known for certain she was his future mate, but the nagging suspicion had driven him to track her down in Philadelphia. At first, she'd merely refused to talk with him, not answering his calls. In his typical determined style, Jax had taken it further, contacting her brother, Tristan, Alpha of Lyceum Wolves. When he'd accused him of attempting to force a mating, Jax had been confused. While it was true that he'd aggressively pursued Katrina, he'd never in any way attempted to coerce her into his pack. The disagreement had escalated, nearly inciting a war between him and her brother. He recalled the fateful night at the club. When he'd witnessed someone who looked like Katrina falling ill, he'd gone soft, rushing to her side. Despite everything that had happened, his protective instinct had driven him to remain with her, insisting he accompany her in the ambulance. The hazy memory lingered, and Jack still couldn't be sure what had happened next. Katrina had transformed into something foreign, something evil. The creature wielded dark magic, injecting him with the poison and rendering him unconscious. During his captivity, it had appeared to him as different people, and he'd questioned his sanity. Jax licked the crust from his lips. The iron-tanged blood only served to remind him of the pain they'd inflicted. All that had been lost. Nick, his beta, had died in battle, his essence soaking into the bayou mud. Despite the tragedy, his freedom robbed, dignity remained wrapped around the Alpha like a steel cloak. Nothing would change the inevitability of the moment or deter him from his task. Every lash of the whip had sharpened his resolve to exact vengeance upon the perpetrator. Deliberate and calm, he'd strategized his attack. Patience had superseded his urge for reprisal. However, today, he'd be free. Dying wasn't an option, but killing, a necessity.